It is 14 minutes past 4, and we have a very special guest on the line for you this afternoon from New Zealand. We have Mike Cook from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon, Mike.
Yes, good afternoon, Matthew, and all our listeners out there. It's actually good evening for us over here on the other side of the ditch. It's a real blessing and privilege to be with you today.
Yes, of course. Now, you, Mike, you were born in England. You moved to New Zealand when you were a little fella. And by the looks well, I've read through your entire bio, and you've worked in sort of the electronics industry, which I'm fascinated by technology. I love it. And you're an electronics engineer and designer. How cool is that?
It is. Yes, I've always had a real interest in all sorts of things, even as a child, taking things apart and not being able to get them back together again. But yes, I've always been a technical type person, and electronics was always a hobby. Yes, I've come down the track for my career involved in electronics and software development with a particular focus on environmental monitoring.
Yes, and it says here you gained broad experience in the earth and biological sciences with the company systems which you've put in sort of all over the world. And then you've also been overseas and had a look at some pretty amazing parts of the world, Mount St. Helens, giant causeways, Cigar Point, Grand Canyon. Oh, I thought that looked awesome. I've flown over the Grand Canyon, Mike, but wow, why did you go to some of these places?
I guess with my real interest in travel, but also in geography in the world, and a creation point of view, love to go to places that may be of geological interest. And the list on our bio page there, Grand Canyon being maybe the most spectacular. And so it's places where people might say this proves evolution over millions of years. Look at these landforms, but to go back to them and see them and interpret them through a biblical lens was a real eye-opener for us, and a real privilege to visit each of these places in person.
Yeah, now, Mike, we do have a question in regards to the Grand Canyon. Interestingly, here on the Central Coast, we've got a lot of sandstone. We see sort of sandstone falling off, cliffs near the beaches all the time. In fact, one of our most famous sort of landmarks on the coast is called the Skillion out at Terrigal, big sandstone outcrop, and a big chunk of it fell off only years ago. In fact, chunks of it fall off all the time. It's constantly sort of falling apart. And, of course, you probably know the 12 Apostles down in Victoria. They're, one of the most famous land formations in Australia. Well, of course, there's only 11 Apostles now because they've caved in as well. And we see in the Grand Canyon, we hear stories about rock falls over there all the time. The question for you, and obviously you've been into the canyon, I've only flown over it, and it is absolutely ginormous. It is huge. But the question is, for this, the world says this is sort of this river that's, taken millions of years to form, and it's formed this, giant canyon. Why are the sides so steep? Why haven't they just all fallen in and rounded off over millions of years?
Well, that's a really good point. When we look at all sorts of landforms, and as you say, one of the things that we focus on a lot with Creation Ministries is rapidly crumbling landforms, and as you say, the 12 Apostles, etc., is a good example. But yes, steep-sided surfaces erode very quickly and tend to become, less inclined, and also the amount of what they call talus, which is the debris at the bottom of these cliffs, is far less than it should be after millions of years. Yeah. So that's a really good question. So when we look at the Grand Canyon, we can either say a small amount of water over a huge amount of time, or a large amount of water in a very short time. And the evidence, as we'll talk about no doubt into future sessions, is about what we see in the world that points to a catastrophic event, not a slow and gradual one.
Yes. Now, in your sort of hikes through the Grand Canyon and looking at Mount St. Helens and things, what sort of discoveries, what sort of epiphanies, I guess, have you seen or sort of have just hit you as you're walking through and around those formations?
I think it's just, as you say, the sheer scale of it. The Grand Canyon is basically a mile deep. It's hugely deep, thousands of metres, with layer after layer of thick sedimentary rock, with almost no erosion between all the layers, and yet it's heavily eroded on the surface. And there's just amazing amounts of fossils and tracks. There's a lot of history there with the First Nation people with their camps and farming areas. So there's history, there's geography, there's beautiful scenery. it's just an inspiring place for size and for beauty. And at night, looking up into the heavens, the sky is just so crystal clear. You just see the whole Milky Way above you. It's just a stunning place for scenery.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we were sort of talking about before, the sides, you were saying, there's not enough debris at the bottom. Now, I've seen many sort of recent stories about, Grand Canyon rock falls. Is there any chance that the rock falls could be happening now, but they didn't happen then because the rock was stronger a million years ago?
No, that's not the case at all. Actually, I should qualify that. When you have a river like that, the debris does tend to go into the river and be moved on. But when you look at a place like Monument Valley, that famous area in the States, it's like a huge flat plain with these volcanic plugs sticking out. That's been stripped clean for hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, and basically there's no sediment or debris there at all, and it's a very dry environment. So the argument about it's been washed away doesn't stack up when we look at those sort of desert environments.
Yeah, unless it was a great flood.
Exactly, and actually you talk about where the rock was stronger in the past. We know that that's not the case, and if we look at places like Arches National Park in the States, they've had 43 arches have collapsed since 1971 when it first became a national park. And these things, we're told, have been around for hundreds of millions of years. And like you say, the 12 Apostles, and in New Zealand, we have one called Elephant Rock that collapsed about 5 years ago. So we're seeing these things falling apart all around the world, yet we're told that they're millions of years old.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? I've always wondered about some of those things. I mean, we look at the Skillion, and we've got a famous photographer here on the Central Coast, a guy called Ken Duncan, who took an amazing photo of the Skillion. Interestingly, he took it before it fell apart, so now it's an even more famous photo because, it's sort of got the big chunks coming out the end before they were gone. But we do see it all the time. We see it on the side of our freeway between just Sydney and the Central Coast where we live. All that sandstone and stuff that's fallen over the years, and the number of times, the Road and Traffic Authority, back in the day that's what they were called, used to have to come along and clear it over and over to get rid of the debris after it kept falling in. So we know it does happen, but to have those hugely big steep sides and so little down below. It's a good question. Yeah, where did it all go? You are on 94.9. Sorry?
Sorry, just one quick thing, just butting in there, is one of the things which I think is almost prophetic is in the Galapagos Islands, there was an arch there called Darwin's Arch, and that collapsed last year, and now it's called the Pillars of Evolution. It's just 2 bits, so even that's fallen apart. I think that's somewhat ironic.
Yeah, what an interesting name to give it, the Pillars of Evolution. 94.9, it's 27 minutes past 4, and we have Mike Cook on the line. He's from New Zealand. He's with Creation Ministries International, and he's been telling us a little bit about his life. He's an electronics whiz, and he's travelled with CMI to places like Mount St Helens and the Grand Canyon and plenty of other awesome places, and looking at, I guess in this case, geological formations. And we were talking about the Grand Canyon and what an awesome place that is, but it certainly shows signs of a very recent beginning of the world, doesn't it, Mike?
Well, it does. It also shows great evidence for the truth of the Bible when it talks about the global flood of Noah's day. We're just seeing all over the earth there are huge continental-wide levels of erosion, sedimentation uplift, and it's just amazing how catastrophically formed the current Earth's surface seems to be. I should introduce your listeners to the term uniformitarianism. That's the idea that the present is the key to the past. So the lens that secular scientists use is they assume that what the rates we measure things today is the way it's always been since, for millions of years. And there's no real room for major catastrophe, especially not a flood. But the evidence all over the world seems to point to a catastrophic flood.
Yes. What about Mount St Helens? Do you see that sort of thing over there?
Yes, Mount St Helens, whether our listeners here are familiar with Mount St Helens, it exploded catastrophically in May 1980 and caused a huge amount of destruction. The top third of the mountain blew off, and it basically caused a huge amount of damage and so on. But afterwards, many things occurred that shows that you can actually have canyons forming, sedimentation forming quickly, erosion forming quickly, and even things pointing to coal-type formation and vertical tree trunks in Spirit Lake. So the things that were observed after the Mount St Helens disaster really point to things where the millions of years just don't stack up. We observed things happening very, very quickly that appeared like they took millions of years to form.
Wow. Okay. Well, we might come back to that very shortly. We're going into a little break now with some weather and traffic, and we'll be back with Mike Cook from Creation Ministries International very soon. If you've got any questions, please send them through to our text line, just SMS 0409. It is 22 minutes to 5, and we have Michael Cook on the line from New Zealand, Creation Ministries International. G'day, Mike. Great to have you back again. And Mike, we've been learning a little bit about your life and a little bit about your travels, but I'd like to know, like, I guess, earlier life, how did your Christianity grow?
That's a really good question. And again, it's good to be back and following on with this. Yeah, so after we came out from England as I was a youngster, and we settled in a town called Nelson, which is the north of the South Island, and Mum and Dad radically came to the Lord through an amazing healing of Mum from Hodgkin's disease, and Dad's workmates praying for him and so on. But yeah, I gave my heart to the Lord as an 11-year-old at a camp, and that really set me up. But when I went to high school, I encountered, I guess, a very atheistic evolutionary teaching from a teacher I really respected. And so for a while, being a thinking type kid, I had this disconnect in my head about what I was taught at home and at church versus what I was taught at school. And so for a number of years, I was sort of closed down. I didn't lose my faith, but I was certainly struggled with putting it all together. So that was a struggle I had during my teenage years.
So how did you put it back together?
Well, it was when I was sort of in our married life, we had a creation speaker came to our church, very similar to the type of talks I do as a creation ministry speaker. And I can't remember a word that was said, but I do remember how I thought that makes sense. I could see that the Bible did make sense as we looked at the things where the Bible touches on geology, biology, those sort of themes. It's not a science book, but it does make claims that are scientific in basis. And I realised I could trust the Bible. It took a number of years, but I subscribed to Creation magazine and reading the Bible with different set of glasses on. I realised that my faith could be rational as well as spiritual.
Yeah. Now, of course, you're being an electronics engineer and designer and having a lot of education. You're a real thinker. You're the sort of person that likes to analyse and literally click things into place. And so that talk that you had that day at church where a guy came along and started telling you about, well, is it evolution or creation? It really changed your mind. You don't particularly remember much about the talk?
Well, I remember the gist of it, but often our relevance talks, we call them, we cover a lot of ground fairly quickly, but it just sows seeds about different things, evidence for the Bible being true when we look at the world around us, scriptures, theologically seeing why death and suffering and pain and bloodshed are things that God didn't use to create. So the whole thing about the character of God, understanding that sort of stuff as well. So it's a theological and, I guess, scientific journey that we do as a ministry. We're there to equip the body of Christ and to help evangelism by showing that the Bible can be trusted. It's reliable, including the very first book, Genesis, which is often under attack, but it's foundational to so much doctrine that we believe as Christians.
Yes. Now, of course, you gave your heart to God when you were young, and you wouldn't have had a lot of knowledge about, well, a lot of things because you were only young. And then, of course, you go through schooling and it sort of gets, I guess, beaten out of you a little bit, and there's a lot of questions. Then all of a sudden you sat in a church, you listened to one of these talks, and a lot of those questions were answered. And they must have been answered fairly powerfully, because here you are now, a number of years later, doing the same sort of talks. What sort of things, and obviously you get these questions in talks that you do at different CMI sort of meetings. What sort of things do you think, what are those main, questions and answers that people ask that make a big difference to their life?
Well, I think, again, so many people are looking for hope and a future and a purpose, but we're told, right through our education system, from secular media, social media, popular movies, and so on, that there is no God. Everything evolved over millions of years. Rules and so on don't really exist. Even moralities are evolving, so people don't have any sort of sense of purpose or direction in their lives. And so, as Christians, we have the answer. We have the gospel. We have the truth of the Bible, and knowing that Jesus is our Creator and Saviour. So we have the good news, but people need to have sometimes blockages that they would have to understanding that pull down. It's a spiritual thing. We need to pray and to really share in a loving way with people. No one gets converted by logic, but we are called to pull down lofty thoughts that are held up against the knowledge of God. So that's what it's about. It's actually a two-pronged thing. It's a spiritual journey, but also we connect our brains as well. We love the Lord with our mind as well as our heart.
Mm-hmm. And as far as your knowledge is concerned, do you find yourself still learning as you go about a lot of this stuff?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I mean, I've done a lot of miles, but I'm always learning, and even though I'm sort of now, I've crossed that threshold into 60-ish, I've done a lot of miles, but I'm still learning, and I'm so blessed by sharing with people of all different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different ages. We all learn from each other. So I don't know it all, but I am learning a lot. But I do know more and more that God is good, He's loving, He's powerful, and I don't have all the answers, but I have more than enough to know that the Christian faith is a very logical, rational faith that I can base my life on and trust it. I've seen so many change lives, change societies because of the gospel.
And where do you go now to get new information when it comes to any sort of evolution, creation sort of stuff?
Well, I try to keep up to date with even secular things. So, for example, the James Webb Space Telescope recently launched. I'm a space nut. I love things like NASA's website and just picking up with secular news and documentaries to hear the other side of the story, to see how they interpret the evidence. But also, of course, Creation Ministries, our scientists and our writers are producing huge amounts of quality resources that are put on our website, put in our Creation magazine. Actually, I should encourage your listeners, creation.com is our website. We're talking about lots today, but questions you may have about the Grand Canyon or Mount St. Helens or the James Webb Space Telescope, we've got articles on all those topics on our website, creation.com. Thousands of articles, YouTube channel, podcast, video things, all for free. Please make use of our website and be blessed.
I do have a question about the website. There's always new articles on the front page. Are they always new articles, or do they put old articles back up?
That's a really good question, Mac. Yeah, so what we have is, with our Creation magazines especially, there's a 1-year embargo just on work from print, and then after that, articles from previous issues are often featuring on the website to keep things moving. But when something crops up in the news, like, for example, again, the James Webb Space Telescope, or a new fossil's found that supposedly proves evolution, or sadly in New Zealand we had the Moss Massacre about 3 years ago, or COVID, all these sort of things, we have our writers producing articles that touch on things that are very topical. So you'll often see a page that's covering a very high-profile event on our front page.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed there's a headline on there at the moment, "Was something created from nothing? And does Schwinger affecting graphene prove that something can come from nothing?" Of course, graphene's only fairly recently discovered, so I assume it's a fairly new article.
It is. It's written by our brilliant Dr. Jonathan Sarfati in the States, and he goes into fairly deep quantum mechanics in that article. It's but it shows again that people try to couch things as something from nothing, but it's never quite as it seems. So you need to understand where the headlines are coming from and what actually was really observed and what the interpretation is.
Yes. Now, I believe you've written a few stories for creation.com as well, and we might have to wait till next week before we talk about them. Because we've pretty much come to an end of our time. I thank you so much. I think we've got a lot more to talk about. It's very interesting learning about your life. And, next week we might get a little bit, we'll delve a little deeper into the creation and evolution side of things. Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you all so much. I guess this is our practice session. It's been a real privilege to be with you, and we'll catch you next week.
Absolutely. You are on 95.